Okay, does this work? It does work. Okay, wonderful. So people are still streaming in, but also for the sake of people online, let's start on time. So welcome everyone. I'm Jeremy Zettelmeier. I'm the director of Bruegel, and this is the beginning of our 2024 Bruegel annual meetings. As you know, the 2024 Bruegel annual meetings mark the rentrée in Brussels for a new quinquennial, for a new 5-year period after a round of European elections. And every time that happens at Bruegel, since 2009, we have written a short volume, a collection of essays of about 3,000 words each, dedicated to the new European Union leadership, in particular to the commissioners that hold various portfolios, but of course also to the President of the Commission, the President of the Council, and the President of the European Parliament. And so the idea of this annual meeting, as the 2019 one, is to discuss those memos with you, with policymakers, with outside academics, with Bruegel's members. And so, you know, unlike, for example, the previous annual meeting, we're not starting with a keynote speaker, as we would usually do. We are starting with a discussion of the, if you like, flagship memorandum, the memo to the presidents, plural, of the Commission, Council, and European Parliaments. And the fact that you show up like you do, even just for us, without, say, Mario Draghi as the keynote speaker, is very flattering. And, you know, we were actually hoping this might coincide with the publication of the Draghi report, but maybe it's better that they are slightly spaced out, and we will have possibly another show next week. So, what we will do today is I will give you a short presentation of the highlights of the memo to the presidents. We will then have a panel discussion led by Christian Odendahl from The Economist. So Christian is the economics editor for Europe of The Economist of London. He was previously you know, the leading continental thinker, I would say. He's actually German, even though he hails from London today. At the Center for European Reform, a wonderful think tank with whom we have friendly competition. And so he came down to moderate the session. We also have André Shapir, who you know, is known to everyone in Brussels as, you know, one of the most experienced, sharpest observers. He's one of the, you know, handful of people that have a report in their name, the Shapir report of 2003. And if you read the Shapir report of 2003 and you compare it to our memos, you will probably find that the differences are limited, at least on some areas. And last of these, and by the way, André is also a professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, in addition to a senior fellow at Bruegel. And then we have, in the middle between the two gentlemen, Maria de Mertzis, who of course is Bruegel's former deputy director and, until 3 days ago, senior fellow at Bruegel. She has just left Bruegel for greener pastures. She's going to work as the head of economic strategy and finance for the European chapter of the Conference Board, which is a very interesting organization, I think somewhere between a think tank and a private sector organization. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to take you through the highlights of our memos. You know, as you know, the title of our memos is Unite, Defend, Grow. It will probably become clearer why we chose that title. But, you know, at some level, we could have used the old title, the title from 2019, which was Braver, Greener, Fairer, a really cool title, I think, sort of a once-in-a-millennium title. And, you know, it struck me that we might just return to the old title and twist it a little bit along the lines of, you know, even braver, because we need that today, you know, greener as well. Even fairer, I'm not sure. I don't think we can be both greener and fairer. So maybe even braver, greener, and fair would have been enough. But we wanted something new, and so we came up with Unite, Defend, and Grow, and you will see why when I take you through this. So I'll show you about 4 slides, and we will be done in less than 50 minutes, and then have a nice debate. Let me see if I can change this. Yes. So, one way of looking at our current situation is that we started the last quinquennial with big geopolitical challenges, some domestic economic challenges, slow productivity growth relative to the United States, even more, of course, relative to fast-growing economies in the emerging world, and, of course, the overwhelming challenge of tackling climate change. Then we kind of took a break from these challenges in a sense to fight two acute crises which were even more pressing. First COVID, and then the war on Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and the ensuing energy crisis, and that sort of absorbed most of our energy. We still worried about some of the longer-term problems, but those were clearly the massive, unanticipated problems of the day. And now, having fought that, we are returning to the old challenges, and we are finding that they're still there. But with one big difference, which is they have actually gotten a lot tougher in the meantime. And they have gotten a lot tougher fundamentally for two reasons. One is that sort of the underlying structural problem that was already there in 2019 has become tougher. The other one is that our means to address these crises have become tighter, right? And so that's both fiscally and politically. So I think you really can boil it down to three issues: growth, decarbonization, and security. On growth, the baseline problem before the last set of crises was comparatively low productivity growth in Europe. It still is that problem, but now it's exacerbated by first what economists would call a persistent terms of trade shock. So our imports have become structurally more expensive relative to our exports, and this is reflected in higher energy prices over the medium term, hopefully not over the long term. That depends on what we do with the green transition. We have even bigger competitiveness challenges that we used to have, and that has to do with what has happened in China above all. So we have essentially China is no longer there as a growing export market that can absorb, for example, manufacturing exports from Europe and help Europe grow out of a crisis. And we face increasing competition in international markets as well. Importantly, we started the last quinquennial, even though we maybe didn't quite realize it, with a relatively comfortable fiscal position. And that is now gone. And so one consequence of that is that we have given ourselves the task with the new fiscal rules to adjust, anywhere for about at least half of the EU countries by anywhere between 0.5 point and 4 or more points of GDP per year over the next 4 to 7 years, over the medium term. Now, there is an issue of, to what extent will this become a reality? But at least that is the intention, what we are committing to. And so there is a long-term, medium-term, perhaps not long-term, but medium-term fiscal drag on the horizon. And finally, the longer-term adverse demographics that we, of course, knew about in 2019, but did not feel as much yet, are kicking in. On decarbonization, we have the same baseline problem. We have less money to deal with it, and we have less political space because we have an even more polarized electorate. In the meantime, the global carbon budget is vanishing, and my increasing concern is that we might get everything right in the EU, but the global carbon battle is going to be fought outside the EU, and we are not nearly focused enough on supporting that. And finally, and this, to the extent that we have a new theme, this is the big new theme, security. But, arguably even 2019, there was a security issue. It was part of the theme of a geopolitical commission that Ursula von der Leyen put on the table in 2019. And so the idea is here, we are too dependent on our security on the United States. We have Russia next door. Russia was an aggressive power even in 2019. They had the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We were too complacent about it at the time, and now we have a much more acute Russian threat. And on top of this, we have an economic security threat that we woke up to as a result of, first, the COVID port closures, the supply shocks that came with it, Second, the Russian stop in gas exports. And third, of course, economic coercion from China hitting countries like Latvia. So those are the problems, essentially the same problems, but worse. Now, I should quickly say we haven't been, I mean, on the whole, I think we have had a pretty impressive quinquennial. So we haven't been standing still the last 5 years. And that's true not only because the two big crises, the COVID and the attack on Ukraine, were actually tackled remarkably well in the EU, as members and the EU level acted in concert. So we have the NGEU funds as sort of the big, huge symbol of that acting in concert. The joint vaccine program, we were effective in at least deciding on sanctions packages against Russia, perhaps less effective in implementing them in a tight way. Assistance to Ukraine has been massive, and we did avoid a meltdown of European energy markets in the winter of 2022. And that was a very widespread fear. That was actually quite serious, and it did not happen. We've also, in the meantime, had legislation that was not just about these short-term issues, but recognized and started to address the longer-term challenges. So this is, of course, mainly climate legislation, along with some funds to support it, so the 2030 goals and the energy and climate plans that were to implement those goals were formulated in the last few years. We've had a flurry of digital regulation, including particularly the really important Digital Markets Act that safeguards competition, or is meant to safeguard competition in a proactive way, as opposed to just legislating as opposed to litigating exposed, which is always too slow in the digital area. We have had new economic security legislation, so to its great credit, the European Commission really jumped on the economic security theme almost even before the Russian invasion happened, right? So this was immediately after the COVID shock, when they started worrying about import dependency, and this led to things like the Anti-Coercion Act, which is a way of deterring economic coercion. And finally, we reached, with remarkable speed, an acceptable compromise on fiscal rules, and that was not anticipated. So most people last summer would have thought that we would not have been able to get this through by the end of the legislature period, but we did. Now, is it a great compromise? Probably not. Everyone will find fault with the new set of fiscal rules, myself included, but I can assure you, and I can debate this, and we have evidence to prove it, that this is a better set of fiscal rules than the last one, and it's better than having no rules at all. Now, not all has been great, so we have done very little progress on the single market. There has been very little progress on banking union. There has been very little progress on capital market union. There has been virtually no progress on increasing the tax base for the European Union, the so-called own resources. So we have legislated spending, we have gone into borrowing, but we are not completely sure how to pay for it. In a legal way, we are sure it will be repaid, but ideally it should be repaid by higher own resources, and that is lacking. There are dangers of over-regulating, so we pushed out a ton of regulation in a very short time, and you always make mistakes, and the institutional mechanisms that guard us from these mistakes were not always satisfied. And finally, and most disturbingly to me, we have had a really confused debate about sort of the heart and soul of the EU's economic model. And so the essence of that debate is that, you know, we have clung to a particular vision, which is open, rules-based trade, rules within the EU, state aid rules, competition, as the driver of EU prosperity for a long time. And I believe, along with, I think, at least the majority of my panelists, that this was in fact the driver of EU prosperity for a long time. Now, it's also clear that this is an incomplete paradigm. And, you know, simply clinging to it without modifying and improving it amounts to complacency. But recognizing that we are complacent and we have to modify the model does not in itself make for a better model. And so what worries me is that in the criticism of the model and in the attempt to complement it, A really remarkable amount of stupid stuff has been written and discussed in Brussels, and in particular, the failure to recognize trade-offs. So if you read something like the recitals, the beginning section of the Net Zero Industry Act, you could be forgiving for thinking that reshoring will make the EU grow faster, make it greener, and make it safer all at the same time. And that's complete nonsense. So it may make it safer, it will not make it grow faster, and it's bad for the green transition. And we need a policy concept that addresses these trade-offs. And so that gets me into sort of what we want from the new EU leadership. And because the last slide, which is behind this one, is going to have a little bit of a laundry list, I want to impress on you just the main two principles, which I think are worth highlighting. So the first is what I just said. We need to understand, they need to understand where trade-offs between objectives are inevitable and where they are not. And so trade-offs can be inevitable as a result of two things: limited fiscal resources, so you cannot do everything all at once if you don't have money to do it, so you have to think carefully about where you spend, but not only that, you then need to be brave enough to actually raise new resources, which gets me to the second point. And then, of course, reduced openness may help security, it may help social cohesion, but it hurts growth and it hurts the green transition. In contrast, there are other policies where there are no such trade-offs. Right? It's important to understand that you can have both. And the one policy where there's no trade-off is a deeper and broader single market. So this will help you both on the growth and the economic security front. When you restrict trade openness, there's a conflict between growth and economic security. When you deepen the single market, there is not. Vigorous competition enforcement within the EU helps both growth and external competitiveness. The idea that competition in the EU and competitiveness of the EU are in conflict is a red herring, and one session will explore that in more detail. And finally, we need improvements in EU governments like qualified majority voting. Now, you're immediately going to say, well, but this is politically all unrealistic. And that's the point of the slide. The point of the slide is to say, once you understand that there's no free lunch on these easy policies, that you're going to have the conflicts, you should then go back and test the supposed political non-realism of things. Because maybe the only way we can survive these challenges is by pushing the political red lines. That's essentially the bottom line for me, and so we will need more coordination of national policies, we will need more delegation to the EU where it's efficient, we may need common funding, we will need to break down remaining single market barriers, EU budget reform, and EU-level decision-making. And so let me just leave you with the last slide. I will not go through it. These are sort of the top 10 concrete recommendations. So, they are still headlines, but we have substance below them. We want to deepen the single market in areas where the growth impact is highest. This is particularly energy, but also, of course, capital markets and banking union and some services markets. We will need, and sort of that is our concession to the argument, which we agree with partly, that the EU often over-regulates. We will need to curb regulatory excess in the sake of growth. And that involves mostly institutional improvements, more systematic impact assessment, independent ex-post evaluation, and possibly a single digital regulator. We will need to improve and expand EU-level innovation and industrial policy. So for me, innovation and industrial policy are very close. They're almost the same. It's very hard to do. It is particularly hard to do in the EU, because if you do it at the national level, you destroy the single market. So we will need to do it more at the EU level, but we need to do it in a clever way that requires a reformed and only then expanded EU budget, focus on EU public goods. This is the point that is almost identical to what is in the 2003 Shapir report. We should depend competition, openness, and multilateralism. Of course, we cannot be naive how we do it. Countervailing tariffs can be necessary, but should be within multilateral rules. We must safeguard the Green Deal, and not only safeguard it by protecting vulnerable groups, but we also need to extend its global reach. We need to focus much more on the international dimension. We will need to continue supporting Ukraine, basically doing what it takes to prevent Russia from winning this war, strengthen the EU defense, create a single market for the defense industry, which we do not have. Ideally, that single market for the defense industry should include the UK. We have a chance to restart our relationship with the UK. There are blind spots in economic security. We have been disproportionately focused on import dependence, but export dependence, profit concentrations, foreign assets and payment systems are also important. And finally, we will need to reform EU decision-making for greater efficiency, but also for enlargement, which of course is crucially back on the agenda, which is great, but also a challenging prospect. Let me stop here. Christian, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy, and also thanks for Maria and Andre to join me here on the stage to discuss this. Just one note of housekeeping: those of you who watch us online, you can ask questions on Slido using the hashtag #LeadershipEU, and that will pop up on this wonderful little iPad here. And I will try to work those questions in, and we will discuss among ourselves for maybe 30 minutes, and then I'll take questions from the audience, even though I cannot see anything. But people will help me if and when you raise your hands. But you can already think about challenging questions to ask these three. Andre, can I start with you? Jeremy gently hinted that you've been around for a while. I'm wondering, sort of, to what extent is this time a bit different, in a sense that some of the major crises affecting Europe all touch upon issues such as defense and security, energy to a degree, economic security, that are not necessarily core elements of what the EU usually does and has done in the past. So to what extent are these memos that you're addressing to the EU leadership, to what extent are they really addressed at national leaders in that sense?
I think that's a very good question. I mean the answer typically would be they're addressed to Team Europe, right? And Team Europe is indeed Brussels and the capitals. And there's no way out of that, right? We were at a conference with Jeremy this summer on Lake Como, and you remember, Jeremy, I kept repeating in this discussion we need to reflect on who we are. And I think that discussion with Jeremy proposed that we need to be bold in sort of opening up the door of difficult questions. When I was young, we were talking of the common market. That's what we were describing the European institution as the common market, not just what it was doing, but that's what it was about. When I started to work in the Commission, 1990, it was sort of the single market. It was the common market, but that was the order of the day. Then we did the euro. Well, it was single market plus single currency, and now we are in a completely different world. And it's true that when I did this report with my colleagues 20 years ago, an agenda for a growing Europe, it picked on one of the three words of our memos: unite, defend, grow. So now there are those two other words, unite and defend, that I think we would not have put forward 20 years ago. So the environment has changed. And I just want to say this: the environment has changed externally. This is the geopolitics, but internally. Look a little bit what's the politics in France, what's the politics in Germany. So this is, I think, a pretty difficult order. Grow is still there, but in a completely different environment. And obviously there's the climate. And the climate requires a new economic model also. So it's grow, but grow in a different manner than before. So yes, I think the challenges are very complicated. And therefore, yes, I think we do need to unite, defend, and grow, I think, in that order.
Thank you. I think, Maria, can we talk about economic security, because that is one of those issues that will be way high up on the agenda. when I talk to experts on Japanese economic security policy, what they always point out, and why Japan has been so relatively successful in this, is a unity of purpose. And this is sort of where I look at the EU and think, well, do we have a unity of purpose? We have 27 different countries wanting 27 different things, and many of the things that that need to be implemented on economic security are not necessarily European competence. So how can we create sort of this unity of purpose among the 27 when it comes to economic security?
Okay, there's many questions in. Well, thanks for the question. There's many aspects to that. I mean, if I may go back just a little bit on the first question, because it feeds into the economic security also. That is actually one big difference between now and maybe 5 years ago, when the term economic security wasn't ever being discussed, and now it's up there. And up, dare I say, the new Commission, or the previous Commission, was characterized by a geopolitical commission. I think this one will be characterized as an economic security commission, maybe security more generally, but certainly economic security will be, if not the first priority, one of the first ones. But I wanted to also say maybe one more thing about what I perceive to be different. It's interesting, Andrea talked about when the EU was created, the EEC at the time, and one of the driving forces or narratives behind that was, you know, when we trade, we don't go to war with each other, right? That was actually a good way, a good slogan for introducing the European Union, creating a united approach, at least to certain things. I'm stricken by the fact that we continue to trade, but we are in war with countries. I mean, that narrative of, you know, let's trade together so that we don't go to war is actually fading, and I find that actually quite problematic. It's interesting that the problems that we need to solve, if anything, require greater global cooperation, climate being, of course, the most important one, and we are going exactly the opposite way. I find that striking. Now, on the economic security, I tend to think of it as in two ways. Economic security, in my view, means diversification, and it means being able to stand on our own feet. More than otherwise. So I think Jeremy called it about this excessive dependence on exports is now need to sort of be balanced by more internal, not just consumption, but also practices, internal practices. And I think perhaps one of the more interesting projects on trying to advance European economic security is the digital euro. Is the one aspect of the digital euro that is has a very big economic security aspect to that, is indeed the digital euro that is going to help the European Union stand on its own feet when it comes to payment systems. I think that is perhaps one of the big value added. We are still struggling to find the value added of the digital euro, but I think that is one. But on the diversification side, you know, we need to. There are certain things we can do something about. Energy being the most obvious one. Others that are not so easy. I'm thinking of critical raw materials. There are some uncomfortable dependencies, and we need to think about how to deal with them and what would they imply in catastrophic situations. And then there is this issue of what can we do by ourselves, not just optimize on the cost side, but also optimize on the business continuity side.
Jeremy, I have to ask you about the single market. Whenever you ask an economist about what the EU should do, it doesn't matter what the question is, the answer is always deep in the single market, right? And even if I write an economist leader and forget it, right, it has to be in there, right? So, but you pointed out in the memo that not much has happened in the last 5 years. So to what extent should we be hopeful that that at some point I don't have to write this anymore because it has been completed?
Okay. Maybe before I answer, I should just say there are lots of people standing, which gives us a great feeling here on the stage, but probably not you. But there are about 8 seats just in the first 3 rows. So by all means, people should come and
exactly.
Get
there's one right in front of us.
Right here. There's one there. There's several in the middle.
There's
so
one
please come down. And then, while people are not paying attention, I can try and avoid your question. It will never stop. We will always want to improve the single market. Let's also recognize that we have language and national preferences impediments, which mean that our single market will never quite be where the EU is, right? But if you look at serious studies, there is still unrealized potential. So the most pessimistic study says about 80% of the remaining single market barriers are sort of deep preferences / language. Of course, language can also be improved, but the rest are not. And so why, in what sense can we do more? So the first thing is this distinction between harmonization and sort of targeted cooperation and coordination in specific sectors. So for the most part, the single market agenda has been a harmonization agenda. And harmonization is incredibly difficult because it is about imposing uniformity and imposing EU-level collective preferences over national preferences. And so you get into this, you know, convex cost and sort of rising marginal cost of politically pushing this through. And so in this area, for the last 15 years, essentially since the Services Act and the Lisbon Treaty, there has not really been a big push, except in the digital area, which was a response to new problems. In the last 15 years, the overwhelming emphasis of the Commission has been monitoring, enforcement, implementation of existing rules. And that has been good. But at this point, you know, given that the barbarians are at the gate, we probably do need to take a new look at actually passing new legislation that addresses remaining, particularly services barriers, right? So that is a new push. We have to look, but nothing has been, very little has been done since 2009. So that is one. The other one is there is plenty of untapped potential, particularly on energy. And of course, we have the Capital Markets Union agenda, right? And those are very specific. They are usually not so encompassed. They're not part of the, they're only partly part of the harmonization agenda. On energy, for example, it would be a matter of coordinating renewable investments, right? We have a common set of objectives, but they are underpinned by national energy and climate plans. And so, you know, the default is that every country does a little bit of solar and a little bit of wind investment on its own territory. It would be much more efficient if we could do this at the European level and exploit the gains from trade. So we've had a paper by Bruegel that really explains this. And these sorts of areas where there are very high gains, I think we can make progress.
Okay, that's encouraging. So the in the discussion in the sort of the geo-economic competition with the US and China, I regularly hear that Europe does not have the scale, right? We talked about this briefly before we came on stage, of its firms, of its markets, of its political power, even though Europe has all the ingredients in terms of size, right? Population, economic heft. So how can we tackle this issue of, Maria, maybe we can come back to our discussion from just before we went on stage. What are the most important steps for Europe to increase its scale and make sure that its scale matters on the global stage?
So maybe I can maybe pick up on something that Jeremy said, which I think is very important. I think Jeremy defined what I would call, quote unquote, physical limitations to that scale, right? I mean, the preferences and languages, you will never be able to get rid of that, nor one should get rid of that. So there are some physical limitations to how far this scale can go. So this unity, certainly on the single market, can go. But there are ways of approaching it in the other way. Small gains on certain things, I think, are absolutely essential. And I think that's actually what effectively Jeremy was saying as well. There are outside problems that require imminent reactions. Defense is one of them. I mean, defense can escalate in ways that could be extremely difficult for us. Needed to preventing that. And of course, if you have economies of scale on defense, that is going to be a big win. Now, I'm not saying we can ever have a common defense policy because we don't have a common foreign policy, but we can do things on defense, and there are low-hanging fruits on the issue of defense, on the procurement side, for example, that is going to provide some of that scale. Enlargement is another one. And here the trade-offs are kicking in again. The governance of the EU versus enlargement. Well, I mean, if you're thinking about trade-offs, we are now on the scale where you need more. We need the size much more than we need smooth governance. And I think I would be a proponent of quick enlargement because you are increasing the alliance, and in the context of geopolitics globally, this is a very important contribution to that scale. And I think at the end of the day, if I was to find a guiding principle on where can we achieve scale and where we cannot, cannot, I would think of EU public goods. What is a European public good? Meaning a good that unless it's provided at the EU level, it will not be provided well. So climate being one of them. If we only follow our own country policies, we are missing out, it is costing much more, and we're missing out on rapid progress.
Andre, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I want to come back a little bit to what both Maria and Jeremy said in relationship to the single market and in this picture. To me, the problem that we have is not so much one of barriers to mobility. There are still barriers to mobility of goods, of services, of people, of capital. There are still some of those barriers. I think that the fundamental barriers, if you are looking in the global picture, as you are in your question, Christian, it's not there that the single market is failing. I think the main barrier is barrier to entry of firms. And there, the capital market union has a role to play, right? In sort of providing the financing of new firms, but it's not just that. It's also the incumbents, and that brings me, I think, to this discussion, which is central, has become central to policy making, and maybe will even be more central in the next 5 years, is industrial policy. Okay? Something we would not have thought, we would bring back to the core of the discussion. And in a sense, in Europe, when the single market program was put into place, the single market was viewed as the core of industrial policy. This is EU industrial policy, is single market policy, is EU policy. Well, industrial policy is inherently in Europe at the national level, because this is where many of the tools are, and hence trying to regulate state aid. Now, what happens with industrial policy of a certain kind, industrial policy which is mostly subsidy-driven, that's industrial policy which is driven also by the incumbents. And that's my very, very big fear at the moment. I'm not against industrial policy, because yes, we are at a time where we need to reshape our industrial landscape because of the climate issue. And so that reshaping of the industrial landscape, including innovation, does require industrial policy. Policy addressed at industry, at this renewal of industry. But not, I don't want that we go back to the old industrial policy, which is captured by the incumbents. That's exactly what we should not do. And that's exactly what is the problem, I think, of the single market. And that's why 20 years ago, when we did our report for President Prodi, we did not call really for more single market. We called for a dynamic single market. I think this is still the core of the issue. So I'm very much hoping that the conversation about the single market will be less about barriers, all kind of barriers, that they are still, they are there. I'm not saying that they are not there. But I think what we have not managed to solve is this dynamic element, these barriers to entry. And the problem of, having new firms. It's not just growing of the old firms. Sure, the old firms are there, and it's one of our strengths, but they should not take the space to limit new ones to enter.
Thank you. Jeremy, when the first draft of the Net Zero Industrial Act came out, I think it set sort of Soviet-style production targets for solar panels and heat pumps and so forth. Now we hear that industrial policy is sort of a rather different kind. I mean, what is it in terms of industrial policy that is both realistic politically, that works financially, and that works inside the single market without breaking it apart?
So you can have two things, and they are both discussed in the memo. So one set is discussed in the memo on the single market, and the other one in our chapter on innovation policy. The first is you can try and complement or incentivize a national level industrial policy through EU level co-financing. So you can have relatively small volumes that in effect subsidize a national level industrial policy where it is single market friendly, meaning where projects among member states have broader benefits. So this is essentially the existing idea of the European projects of common European interest, except that these projects, you know, they're fine, they're a step in the right direction, but they suffer a lot from the problem that André just stated, which is they are very much dominated by a few countries and by large incumbent firms. And so if you co-finance with EU money for projects that involve broader spillovers, then I think we can, in effect, put national money at a good common use. So this is one idea. There's a related idea called auctions as a service, which is too complicated to go through now, but it has the same idea. So you essentially complement EU and national money. And then the other important idea is there are forms of industrial policy that are not so expensive. So there is the one successful US industrial policy is the Advanced Research Projects Agencies, the ARPAs. You know, these are budgets in the order of perhaps $4 billion US dollars a year. And so the idea here is that if you want technology open industrial policy, so that avoids writing lists that are outdated, it avoids sort of these obvious planning mistakes that we associate with the old industrial policy, the only way of doing that is to allow discretion. So you need really smart people that make discretionary decisions on what to fund based on a broad guideline of what the objective is, rather like independent central bankers, or rather like one of the institutions I had the honor of working for, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that has a broad mandate. They call it a transition mandate. You could call it a structural improvement mandate. And then you have bankers that are tasked to select projects that serve the mandate. And these are completely discretionary choices. But they are governed by a strong internal governance structure. So it's not, again, like the application of competition policy. Right? There's a German tradition that views competition policy as something that's completely rule-based. In fact, we require discretionary decisions on when to detect a monopoly or not, who to go after or not. This is done by individual people. In preventing abuse requires strong governance. And so we have not come to the end of this at the EU level. We have a very strong innovation policy for basic research. We do not have strong innovation institutions for this mission-oriented innovation policy. And so we can build ARPA-like institutions if they are strongly governed and endow them with a few billion a year, and they can do good.
All right, so we are on the topic of money then, sort of where the money for various kinds of investments are coming from. In your memo, you had the figure of almost 500 billion annually in terms of investment that is needed. Maybe we can break down so where this money is supposed to come from. And starting with you, André, and the EU budget. I mean, the EU budget is not big, but it can make a material difference, as Jeremy has just laid out. The problem is, of course, that a lot of the budget spending is wasteful, if I may say it so bluntly. You, in a piece, I think in 2004, already called the EU budget a relic of the past, 20 years ago, and it hasn't changed much since. So, is now, you suggested in the memo that it should be expanded, but only after it is properly reformed. I mean, what does a proper reform look like, and is now sort of the opening, political opening, that it can finally happen?
Okay, I would not use the word wasteful, because I mean that's okay. That's okay that you do, but I don't think that's the right way, neither politically nor even economically, to approach this. I would say it's not allocated at the right level. So some of the money for agriculture, I wouldn't say it's wasteful at all, but does it need to be in the EU budget? So I think we are facing the following choice. The EU budget is roughly 1% of GDP, okay? Roughly 1%. It's very, very small. So either we keep the current structure, okay? 1/3 for agriculture, 1/3 for the structural funds, and 1/3 for the rest. Or we say, well, we are facing new problems, and we are facing new problems that indeed, including the industrial policy and the renovation of the industrial landscape of Europe and the defense and all of those European public goods, right? As there is one of the memo on budget puts the center of the discussion on European public goods. And I think that's the right way. That is, what is it that we do best at the European level? And what is it that we do best at the national level, at the regional level? So if we have 1%, if we keep 1%, okay, if that's a political choice, you don't want to expand the budget, you don't want to go to 2%, 3%, something of that sort, you want to keep 1%, then I think we have no choice but to be more intelligent. So it's not about wasteful, it's about more intelligent allocation of this 1% to where the money can really bring the most results. And I don't think that's agriculture. I'm not calling for reduction of agricultural funds.
You can.
I'm calling for...
You can.
Yes, I know. But I'm not even doing that. I'm not entering into that discussion. I'm saying let's not do it so much at the EU level. Use better the money for the European public good. I think that's the center. Or you go and double, you keep everything that you have there, and then you add 1% of GDP. Well, that's the choice. If I were the president of the Commission, this is what I would tell to the leaders. This is the choice that you have. Mm-hmm. At this stage where we are, either we change the budget with 1%, or you give me another 1%. But we can't sort of keep this fantasy any longer.
Okay. Maria, can we, if public money is sort of one part and private money is the other, and that brings me to our favorite subject, the Capital Markets Union. I sense a renewed interest in the topic, if I may say so. And the cynical part of me says, well, this is because the politicians are running out of money and they are trying to find someone else to pay for it. But I mean, there's also a more optimistic case, I guess, right? That there is a deeper sense of maybe the Capital Markets Union finally has a purpose, if I may say it so bluntly.
It had always had a purpose. The urgency is much bigger now, I think. I think that's what the issue is. Just maybe if I can comment on something on comments, I guess I can't resist. Andre, you're always so suave when it comes to the description of the issue. But if you were an outsider looking in, somebody outside the European Union, and it says, okay, so how do you guys organize yourselves? You have 1%. Do you use it intelligibly? I mean, what would they say? Are we using the 1% intelligently? I mean, we are not very strategic on the way that we're using the 1%. So I think the urgency of reforming the budget is there, right? Okay, now Andre also talked about barriers to entry, and he talked about dynamic economies. I think finance and private finance is the one piece that is really missing, and of course that brings us to the CMU agenda. I cannot be optimistic on the CMU agenda. However, we need to make even small steps. The way to cut that pessimism is to do small gains. And let me start on the pessimistic side. I mean, we often talk about banking union and how much more advanced we are. We don't have a banking union. We have common regulation, but we don't have a single market for banks. And what makes us believe that we can have a capital market union if we can't even have a banking union, right? Which is the dominant financing tool in Europe is banks. They're banks. So on the capital markets agenda, I think one way to think about it is that the emphasis, and I think Jeremy also touched on this, is very much on the union. But actually, there are bits of Europe, important bits of Europe, that don't have capital markets developed. Because essentially, for creating capital markets, we need to think about the consumer saving differently. This is at the core of it. If you want to make a big transformation change, this is where the emphasis should be. How does the consumer save differently? And for that, of course, you need policy because you need pension funds, for example. So you need second pillar, third pillar developed markets on the pension fund that are going to be the drivers of those investments of, responsible investments of the consumer savings. But this isn't something that you can achieve with just by turning a knob to the left or turning it to the right, because you're talking about educating consumers to save differently. In Europe, typically, we put our money in a bank and we buy houses. Well, we need to move a little bit away of that, so we create that pot that is going to provide the dynamism. Interesting, Christian. You named the 500 billion, which is in our report as this is the Commission estimate on the green and the digital transition annual investment gaps every year between now and 2030. The European Commission is forecasting that 2025 the European Union will have a current account surplus of 2.5. That amounts to a little bit short than 500 billion, which means that there is private money that is leaving the European Union simply because there's no investment opportunity. So there's an enormous inconsistency between a huge investment needs and private money leaving the European Union for better pastures because there isn't enough to do here. So we need to think very, very hard. How do we, and that, there is going to be a discussion on the regulations. How do we induce the private sector to stay in Europe and invest on remove some of the barriers of entry so that there is money, quick wins, that they can allow private money to stay.
And then, Jeremy, there is national fiscal policies as well. You outlined sort of briefly the compromise on fiscal rules. The context, I guess, is that during the pandemic we thought, well, this lead to a huge debt buildup. Basically, we're screwed. It didn't turn out quite that badly, but then now we are facing a sort of fiscal squeeze across the board, including in Germany, which is a new experience for many. How do you expect national fiscal policy to manage this fiscal squeeze while at the same time being able to invest enough? And that was even true before defense, right? But now defense comes on top. I mean, we are both sort of cheery German optimists, but I'm struggling sort of to picture how this can work, the fiscal squeeze and the investment needs, how they fit together.
How politically constrained do you want my answer to be?
Not at all.
Okay. So look, one useful way of thinking of a pro-European growth program is to imagine we are Japan and we have a low growth problem. We would probably come up with a European version of Abenomics where we would combine some targeted fiscal expansion with structural reform in a big and coordinated way. We cannot do that, but we have to get as close as possible to that optimum within our current constraints. And then the question is, what are the constraints that we really expect to have to bind, right? So I would say that we need the new fiscal rules to work. They're not perfect, but they have quite a lot of flexibility, particularly in allowing trade-offs between reforms and the pace of fiscal adjustment. And so those trade-offs should be maximized. It is clear that countries like France, like Italy, should utilize the 7 years adjustment periods as opposed to 4 years. That may be true for other countries as well, Belgium, Spain. And there should be real reforms there. So that is a margin that countries can use. It will still be quite constraining. Importantly, some of those constraints are driven by aspects of the rules, or indeed national rules, that go beyond the minimum that debt sustainability requires. And so those...
Which country do you have in mind?
Indeed. So, Germany, if you look at their 4-year, 7-year requirements under the rules, it's roughly, they need to keep their fiscal structural balance roughly where it is. So it's not that the European fiscal rules are super generous even to Germany. But this business of having annual restrictions because they have to meet a target, that is purely a product of the national fiscal rule, and that national fiscal rule ought to be reformed. Now, ultimately, I cannot think of a way of reconciling, and this is, by the way, this is not the official line of our memo to the presidents. This is my private view, but I cannot think of a way of reconciling in faithful implementation of the European fiscal rules, which I very strongly advise, both for political reasons and because for some countries, the margin that the fiscal rule give relative to what the markets would impose is razor thin. So I don't think that the fiscal rules are too conservative for some high-debt countries. You cannot reconcile a faithful implementation of the fiscal rule, meeting the public investment needs associated with the Green Deal, and ramping up European defense. These three things are impossible to reconcile without new EU common borrowing, right? So ultimately, I'm afraid we will need to go there, or we will need to give up on one of those three.
Okay, that's sobering, but realistic, and I think correct. I have one final question. So if you want to think about sort of the most challenging question you always wanted to ask this panel, now is the time. And I'm going to go back to Andre and ask him about the UK. A lot of the things that the UK has to offer are quite useful to the rest of the continent. And now with the new commission coming in, with a new government in the UK, I guess with the realization in Britain sinking in that this project is a mess, now is, I think, a good time to readjust that relationship. But how exactly should we go about this? There's one question from online, for example, should the UK be encouraged to participate in the EU electricity market? So, for example, in one of those strategic sectors to integrate the UK. Do you have a view of sort of how best to approach this? How to come to a good agreement where both sides benefit?
So I think this is obviously a very, very important issue for both the EU and the UK, or common relationship. At the same time, there are some red lines, I think, that are difficult to navigate around, and that we need to take on board, right? So clearly, the UK in the next 5 years is not re-entering the single market. Clearly, the UK is not re-entering the EU customs union. Okay? This we know, the UK government has decided that. Now, then, okay, we need to take that as given. And I'm staying away from defense. I mean, since defense is the easy part because it's outside of single market, okay, of traditional single market. So you can do everything. You can do a single market in defense because it's not part of the single market. So that's an easy one to do. Now, can you go into some areas, electricity, that are part of the single market, sort of pick and choose, the cherry picking, okay? Which Brussels has said all along, no cherry picking, okay? So no kind of Swiss solution, okay? So the Swiss solution has a lot to offer in a sense, but politically it sounds cherry picking, and Brussels said no cherry picking. So can we navigate around that? Can we do something that is not called cherry picking, but nonetheless has some element of strategic sectors? Defense, as I say, it's easy because it's not part. But can we go into energy green, things of that sort? Personally, I would say yes. So we have to do there, find a package, mutually beneficial package, obviously. Not only for one side. It has to be mutually. But yes, I would personally recommend that we go in this direction.
And we have another question online on how would a defense single market, especially one including the UK, look like in your view, and how would it relate to NATO decision making? So is there, I mean, to the extent that you can answer that, because you said it's relatively easy to include the UK in such a defense single market because defense is outside the single market, as it were. So you would create a market and redefine it so that other countries can join it even if they're not part of the single market.
Maybe you know others want to come in this. But look, if you are looking at European defense, we are really talking of a few actors here. A few actors in terms of countries, a few actors in terms of countries. And it is mainly the large countries, right? It is mainly France, Italy, and Germany in on the EU side, and the UK, a very, very important actor. So yes, there I think that if we are doing a more integrated European defense market, it stands to reason that the UK should be included into this. There's already a lot of interaction. There was all the time a lot of interaction between those companies, including the British company. So I don't think it's really. I think it's a no-brainer in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and with that, I would like to turn to our audience here, which unfortunately I still cannot see. Oh, there I see one hand. Oh yeah. Oh, there's more. All right. Let's start with the gentleman right in the front row. And, oh no, I think the microphone has already been passed to, okay, let's start with the gentleman who just received the microphone. And then please, could you state your name and your affiliation and ask your question?
Philippe Ferran, Center for Global Transformation Studies. So thanks a lot for your insights. I just kind of would like to, not to reflect, but to referring to what you were saying first. Jeremy said, apparently, which is absolutely true, that you cannot stop the climate change at the European level. A lot of things should be done outside the European Union border. So my question is that in your memo, it is stated as one of the priorities to accelerate, as you say, to accelerate the climate action outside the European Union borders. What instruments do you see is efficient to achieve this? And if you allow, just a second question on decoupling from China. So there are numerous, I would say, research papers saying that it's quite feasible and possible to make this decoupling. So it's a price to pay for de-risking from China, given the geopolitical risks we currently have. But in your view, is it truly doable? And if yes, is it worth thinking, especially in the light of what you were saying, you were saying about the perspectives and the attractiveness of the Chinese market itself? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we collect a few more? The gentleman who's just received the microphone, maybe you can stand up, state your name and your affiliation.
Good morning, Pierre Wunsch, National Bank of Belgium. I have a question maybe for the three of you, but you seem quite relaxed on the future of energy-intensive firms in Europe. Now, gas prices in the US, 10 euro per megawatt hour. We are at 35 in Europe, and if you add the cost of decarbonization, will be like between 5 and 10 times more expensive. And we now have a subsidy war going on, which doesn't seem to be stopped or in whichever way sort of controlled by the Commission. So, I mean, I have some cases in mind where it was 400 billion for that company, but then if you move to that country, it's 700 billion, and then if you move to another one, it's at just 1 billion, and the Commission seems to be okay with that. So I would posit that we have a sort of trilemma between the preservation of the single market, openness to trade, and our climate ambition, which is bigger or greater than in some other places.
Excellent. So these were already three very challenging questions. Jeremy, do you want to pick one of those?
So the instruments for international climate action are mostly two, I would say. One is conditional climate finance, so supporting the energy and climate transition plans of large emerging markets, those with the largest emissions, conditional on them essentially phasing out fossil fuel in the energy sector, and particularly coal, right? Phasing out coal. We have a paper on that with Patrick Bolton and Alisa Kleineinhus that came out in June, where this is described. This approach exists in embryonic form in something called the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. They are far under-resourced, and they are not really directly conditional on action. So I think we need bigger commitments on both sides. We need bigger financial commitments by the advanced countries, and we need bigger policy commitments in exchange by the emerging markets. Another area is international emissions trading that requires building new markets, which is feasible, possible, envisaged, in fact, under the Paris Agreement, but very hard to do. So these are the two, I think, main frontier areas. Maybe I should say something on the decoupling question, since it was. So basically, the paper that you refer to, I think, is a paper by a bunch of authors from the Kiel Institute that was, and others, that was published in a volume that Bruegel co-edited with the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, on economic security in Europe. And so this paper basically argues that the long-term welfare costs of a complete decoupling from China are relatively low, so long as Europe and its allies continue trading not just with each other, but with the rest of the world. And the intuition is that, you know, we are very integrated with China, but the rest of the world is still very rich, diverse. So if we have time to rebuild our trade relationships, maybe the long-term welfare loss is not so big. So that's the intuition. Should we still do it? Probably not. You know, maybe this will gradually happen on itself. But I think what this type of approach does not do is factor in the political costs of an aggressive decoupling strategy. So for me, many people say, look, it would be politically and security desirable to decouple from China, but economically it would be too costly. For me, exactly the reverse is true. We could actually economically decouple from China if we do it slowly. The problem is that it would be extremely divisive in the EU. It would be extremely confrontational with respect to China, and we need the global cooperation. That's the main reason why we should not do it. I have thoughts on Pierre Wunsch's question, but I will let others come in.
All right, Maria, do you want to take one of those?
Follow up on this. I find it quite troubling to be thinking about, you know, long-term decoupling from China. Do we really want to go back on trade? I mean, the trade has been a greatest enabler globally, right, on bringing people out of poverty. And now we want to go back on this. Of course, there are, you know, competing business models here. China does business differently, but the idea that we should be aiming at decoupling, I think, in my view, is not wrong. It will harm us in the long run. The question is, how do we find a common denominators between, you know, the Western model and the Chinese model, so that we can continue to do business? I think that is the big unknown here. And I think there is a question addressed to me that you might want to would you like to repeat it so that?
That's about public goods.
The public goods,
yeah. I wanted to come back on some of the questions online that are about spending. But there was the question on heavy industry and energy. If you want to come back on that, if you have thoughts.
Yeah. So the question was from Pierre Wunsch, the governor of the National Bank of Belgium. Even though he's supposed to be a monetary policy maker, he's an incredible energy expert, more than anyone on this panel. So the answer to your question is that we do indeed face a very tough problem. I agree with your trilemma. I think that there is, of course, the longer-term prospect that if we manage to pull off the green transition, build renewables up, and combine that with technical progress in storage, there can be a new future for Europe that has low energy costs and that enables us to continue being energy intensive. But that future is a long way off, and we certainly would not want to subsidize energy costs until that future has arrived. And so the answer presumably is that while I do not think that Europe as a whole will lose its energy-intensive industries. I think that there will likely have to be some change in the industrial geography of Europe, such that we have some relocation of energy-intensive industry, or at least production stages of energy-intensive industry, to the energy-rich regions, particularly in the south of Europe. And so that in itself is going to be politically extremely difficult.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions online which I want to get through. On EU spending, one was directed to you, Maria, on public goods. What are the kinds of public goods that you have in mind, which are sort of the most important public goods that the EU should fund? And Andre, you talked about agricultural spending. How do you convince the current beneficiaries of this agricultural spending to reallocate funds within the EU budget? What is the strategy to do that? Maria, what do you want to talk with public goods? Start with public goods.
Okay, now, thank you very much for the question. I think that's a very important question. We started talking about it a little bit when Andre talked about the budget and repurposing the budget, and I wanted to sort of maybe elevate that into a bigger issue. I want us to think about strategic investments for Europe in the future, right? Before we talked about how to finance them, what are the number one, the number two, number three strategic issues that we need to tackle? Now, strategic means that it doesn't change from one year to the next, so because strategic, but it cannot be for eternity. So you need to be able to revise those. So there is a sense of priority, but it is of strategic relevance, meaning that unless we do it, it will be very, very problematic for the European Union. So thinking about strategic investments and how then to finance them, and then here, we talked about the budget, repurposing the budget. We're talking about trying to encourage private investments. I think part of the way of encouraging private investments is, of course, public-private initiatives. Here, personally, I see an incredible role for the EIB, that is an institution that can take more risk, can afford more risk, and can actually lever up private money. So pick those very risky parts of the investment side, finance them, and therefore attract private capitals. And do it on things that are of European public nature. And of course here, I mean, there is a big catalogue, but I would start with climate, of course, and defense, at least on the way that we want to support Ukraine. There's also a very big, interesting question on Ukraine there. To the extent that we want to support Ukraine, this is preserving the integrity of Ukraine is a public good for the EU, and this would be a very good candidate for my European strategic investment project. But beyond that, you could think also of energy. I mean, if the number one problem in Europe is productivity, firms talk about energy costs and they talk about skills. These are, in that sense, both energy skilling, upskilling, and having ways of reducing energy costs should be of strategic relevance to the European economy, particularly if productivity and competitiveness are so high up in our. So energy might be one of them.
Andre, how do you reform the budget again?
Agriculture, yes. So I think what I was calling for, and one or two of the memos are calling for that, is sort of renationalization of the spending or part of the spending on the common agricultural policy, not of agricultural policy itself. So the common agricultural policy is part of the treaty. So I'm not calling for a treaty change. Nobody's calling for a treaty change to remove agriculture as being a common agricultural policy. There should be a common agricultural policy, because otherwise we are not even starting this conversation if we are going further than that. The question is, does the money need to come from the EU budget? Do countries need to put money into the budget and then receive back money for agriculture? I would say remove some of that money. So it needs to be renationalized, not the policy, but the spending. Okay? So in a sense, the farmers are getting the same thing that they would if it was from the EU budget. Anyway, from the EU budget, where does the money go? It goes to the countries, and it's the country that spend, right? The checks don't go from Brussels to the farmers, right? They go from Brussels to national agencies, and from those national agencies to the farmers. Well, it can go from the national budget, but mandated under the common agricultural policy. I think that's the way to go. You can reform the policies, obviously, as we have reformed all along, because there are new priorities, and there's enlargement and all of it. So, but there is a framework. Mm-hmm. And otherwise, given that this countries, the policy is so subsidized, there would be a subsidy war. You don't want to have a subsidy war, so you want to frame it. There will always be subsidies. There are subsidies in countries in Europe, Switzerland, that are not part of the EU. A huge amount of subsidies. So agriculture, the UK has subsidy for farmers, obviously. So it's not because you're outside of the EU that there is no subsidy. So subsidies will be there, but let part of the money come from national budgets.
Okay. There were two questions here in the front row. One at the very edge of the third row, and one right in the middle in front of me. Please, could you state your name and affiliation?
Yeah, thank you. Is it working? Yeah. My name is Wienand Kwartvlieg. I'm representing the Dutch Confederation of Industries here in Brussels. I have a question on what André Sapir said about the defense industry and integration UK and EU. He said that defense basically is a question of a few big countries and a few big industries. And I wonder whether it's as simple as that, because there are important defense industries and defense suppliers in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic, in Finland, in Sweden, and so on. So I think there is an economic importance to include all those countries and companies, but there is also a political element there, because if we want to have support for a more European defense approach, I think it is necessary politically also to involve those countries and those companies to get more support. Would you like to comment on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's a gentleman. Okay, there was a gentleman over there, I think. Yes. Please state your name and affiliation.
Jakub Groszkowski, PGE. I would like to ask you a question about energy-intensive industries, because we, of course, have all these traditional energy-intensive industries, but there's also artificial intelligence, data centers, and so on, and the whole idea of twin transition. So to what extent should we be eager to resign on developing these new energy-intensive industries in order to achieve the climate goals? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andre, the question addressed to you on defense market in the UK.
Look, I'm not a specialist of the defense market, and I take very much the point. I mean, I know better Belgium, my own country, than obviously the Netherlands. You are obviously right that there are defense equipment or ordnance in smaller countries, and I completely agree with you that all countries should participate in this single market. However, I think the point that I was trying to make is that when it comes to the big ticket items in terms of military procurement, which is aircrafts, which is tanks, there you get to a very small number of producers, and typically in the large countries. So I think, and the point I was also making was with respect to the UK. So if you look in that market of the big ticket items, you will see that the UK and large UK firms are big players. Actually, the largest European defense procurement company is a British company. But you're absolutely right that there are lots of other producers in the smaller countries that should be part of this initiative. Completely agree.
Thanks. Jeremy, there was also a question online on how you see common EU borrowing work in practice. Maybe you can tackle that together with the question on energy-intensive industries again.
So I think politically feasible common European borrowing is likely to be in borrowing dedicated to rearming Europe, because this would be almost by definition temporary, and because it is a response to a direct threat that is very much like COVID. So that's where I think it would happen. And by the way, the same is true for the German constitutional constraints. So it was the choice of the German government not to invoke the emergency clause of their debt brake, even though they could have invoked it, based on the fact that German budgetary pressures are disproportionately attributable to the fact that free discretionary spending, so spending that is not allocated to social programs, to existing military purposes and so forth, was essentially sucked up by Ukraine and by rearmament in Germany, and they chose not to do it. So this is, I think, where what could still happen. And on energy intensive, what was this spin that we had not?
No, that was the
Oh, AI. No, absolutely. No. We should go. Yeah, we should go for AI. It's a matter of where you locate those data centers. But I think we have energy-rich regions in Europe where it could be done.
I think also the net beneficiaries of common EU borrowing for defense would be different ones than in the last round, right?
Indeed.
And
that may help.
That may help. Good. There is one question that came right at the start, and this is about the far right in Europe and how that affects European policymaking. I think you had it in your memo as well, that the political room for maneuver has declined because of the different politics in member states. Maybe could you all three, sort of from your perspective, tell us what you think, how the rise of the far right in some key countries affects European policymaking in the future? Maybe, do you want to start with that?
We have others at Bruegel who are in a much better position to talk about this. But actually, I would argue that the one thing I will say, mostly with common sense rather than with expertise, is the fact that actually the middle ground has held pretty well in Europe, and that we have seen it in countries, but also in the European elections. So in that respect, I think it's a signal, but it's also a victory for policies that are stable, because, I mean, rapid change, particularly if it is so unstable, can be extremely problematic. So I remain very optimistic on European institutions, and by that I mean really general institutions, to manage the rise of the extremes.
Okay, Andre?
I think it is definitely a big problem, the rise of the far right, from a Brussels perspective, from a EU perspective, to the extent that the far right as a populist element. So I think to do policy together with or among populist governments is not easy. Slogans, you know, the time of Brussels, in a sense, that's the good element. It's sort of the medium term. The time of domestic politics is shorter. Okay, so I think it's an advantage, sometimes a frustration, that the EU time is longer, but it gives us also an advantage. It's a bit like in the US, you have Congress, which is short term, every 2 years election, and then you have the Senate, which is 6 years. So to have this in Europe is great, but can be frustrating. So Brussels is not populist. Definitely not. It's not in that kind of business. So the more populist governments are sitting around the table, the more it's making European policy making, I think, complicated. Nonetheless, even in populist governments, they have also demands of their citizens for the medium term, or to deal with crisis, right? We didn't see so much populism at the time of COVID. Right? At the time of COVID, yes, we were able to have NGU, we were able to have procurement, because everybody needed that. So in a sense, the sense that Brussels or Europe provides, I'm going back to the expression, European public goods, that I think is something that should satisfy everybody, whatever the type of government. And then there are some issues where I think it's complicated. So I don't think that everything is complicated by populism, something, yes. And so maybe it forces Europe to concentrate better on what it can deliver at the European level, rather than meddle in some issues that should be and should remain at the national level.
What about Ukraine then? I mean, that is one of the worries that populist right-wing governments may undermine the support of Europe for Ukraine, both in terms of defense and in terms of financing. And in your memos, you clearly say sort of, okay, Ukraine needs to be funded, full stop. Ukraine needs to be supported, full stop. And I think that's right. But it's sort of the political difficulties over the coming years of making sure that happens. We can start with the Russian asset freeze, and to what extent we can prolong the sanctions every 6 months to make sure that the profits from those funds keep flowing, so that the G7 agreement can be put into place. That was one of the questions online. So, Jeremy, how confident are you that Ukraine can be funded and supported throughout the next Commission term?
So on Ukraine, I think this is one of the very, very few topics where I would say that we simply cannot accommodate the far right and the populists. So there are other topics, even migration, where we can say, look, the far right is on the upswing because of a sense that migration is kind of out of control. And so governments should do everything they can to make sure that they have migration under control. It doesn't mean that they should shut borders, but they should have a policy, they should be able to explain their policy, and they should enforce that policy, if necessary, with deportations. So that, if you like, is a partial concession to the political forces that are driving the far right. On Ukraine, this stuff is just so existential for Europe that we just have to say no. We cannot accommodate this. Now, that then leads to the question, how are we going to fund this? Well, I'm afraid it is part of what I think should justify common European borrowing, right? That and rearmament, that is the crisis. Constitutionally, I think it is sound, and politically it will make it easier at the national level.
Thank you. We are coming towards the end of our session, so I just wanted to have one last question from me. If at the end of your final slide, Jeremy, was a long list of policies, and as you know, political bandwidth is limited, so if you were sitting with Ursula von der Leyen, Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron in a room, and they say, okay, what of those should be my number one priority? Could you each give one or two that you think are really, really important and this next Commission should absolutely focus on? Andre is ignoring me.
That's right.
You
you will not be surprised. That's right. I would put on the growth, competitiveness, sort of renovation of rebirth of the European economic model using climate. So the green, I think, is a central element, and that's a big difference from our report 20 years ago. There was no green in there. Somebody had suggested to us that we should have that, and we did not do it. I must say, I bear some of the responsibility. I must admit that. But I think green, that transformation is absolutely essential. So I would say, yes, this green growth,
okay.
I think would be my central element, yes.
Maria, which one would you?
It's interesting that Jeremy actually talked about the title of our previous memo, which had the word brave in it. There's absolutely no disagreement there. We need to be braver, and with that, and again, having somebody looking in from outside, I think it's impossible. And I'm not talking about priorities here, so I'm ignoring your question. I think we had that answer here from Andre, but I think we need to talk about treaty change. I think that there is just the challenges out there will not be met unless we think about Europe differently than we do today.
Oh wow, that's even bigger. Jeremy, you have the final word. I think you switched it off.
Yes, thank you. So I probably would use this 20-second elevator ride with the leaders, Ursula von der Leyen and Costa and the President of the Parliament, to give them the flavor not of the last slide, but the penultimate slide, which is a way of thinking about how you organize the problems rather than the solutions themselves, which is understand where there are trade-offs and where there are not, push the policies where there are no trade-offs, and where you run into those trade-offs, be prepared to cross political red lines, right? That's the summary of that slide. Now, if you forced me to actually pick one of that list of 10, I would say the one is the reform of the EU budget, because that is the one historic thing, the opportunity that they will have. It's the main instrument that's coming up in very short order. I mean, they will have to set their priorities within the next 12 months. In fact, less, right? Because the parliamentary process is long.
Thank you. So with that, we are at the end of this part of the Bruegel annual meetings, the opening session. There will be plenty of room to discuss in the dedicated panels, various of these issues that we've touched upon. And most importantly, of course, around the coffee break, which starts now. Thank you so much.